LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and today we present part 2 of our interview with Graham Nicholls. The show resumes as we move on from discussing the skeptic community and psychic phenomena and begin to explore the nature of the out-of-body experience itself. Well, perhaps now we should turn and talk a little bit more about the headline of this section, which of course is the out-of-body experience itself. One thing that popped into my mind was having a spontaneous out-of-body experience, as I referenced at the top of the hour, could be potentially frightening, particularly if it's the first time it happened to you. I guess you must have had so many of these experiences in your life, it might be difficult to sort of summarise, but I mean, is it possible to have a bad out-of-body experience, or a particularly good one? What is the range of sort of the content of this, as it were?
I guess the majority would be positive, and then the minority would maybe be a little bit hard to move or hard to see or something like that. So you wouldn't say it was negative, it just maybe non-eventful, you could say. But the majority would be fascinating, because even seeing, even looking at an ordinary object can be completely transformative and transcendent in that experience. You look at a plant, for example, one of my early experiences, I looked at a flower while I was in the New Forest in an out-of-body experience. And I looked at that flower, and instead of just seeing the flower and the surface of the flower, my whole awareness felt like it was going into it, and could see the structure of the stem, the fluids moving up and down the stem of the flower, the light being reflected on the petals. You know, the whole thing became alive, if you like. It was like not just seeing it, it was experiencing it directly. And I think that right from the beginning, my out-of-body experiences have had that quality. Even a building. I remember an out-of-body experience where I moved past a children's hospital that I'd attended when I was a child. And as I moved past it, the whole building seemed to be alive with energy. It was like the emotions of all of the different things, all of the positives and negatives and everything that had happened in that building seemed to be radiating out from it. And then even more recently, an experience where I went to the Arctic Ocean, and I was moving over the Arctic Ocean, and went down into a few islands up in sort of Arctic areas, and saw the seed bank, for example, the huge seed bank that they've got up there in the Arctic, that I didn't even know existed. So again, that was a slightly confirmed experience for me, because it was the first I discovered of that place. And then I was also able to identify another island in that area by its shape. Again, something that I definitely wasn't consciously aware of. But I managed to have such a completely transcendent experience. It was quite long. It was about 2 hours long. I travelled throughout that whole area, and the whole experience of the land, the air, everything was heightened to a degree that's very hard to describe in words. It was like everything was infused with light. It's very much like what people describe when they describe the near-death experience. So I think that there is definitely a relationship or a crossover between those kinds of experiences. And those are just a few examples from the hundreds that I've had over the years.
This area crops up in your most recent book, and this is one of the most fascinating things in it for me. It got me thinking, this idea that we've heard before about everything being energy. And if you were perceiving energies that are there, but just not visible to us in our normal waking state, that's just absolutely fascinating. And it's the idea that, buildings, for example, could have an energy. And of course, this is another experience that people have that most people would probably dismiss. I've certainly been in buildings before. I just don't like this place. I'm not staying here. And maybe there's a connection.
Well, yeah, it seems from those kinds of experiences, I started calling that particular kind of out-of-body experience, I started calling it the uric state, because it would be like I was seeing, instead of seeing things as they look, in terms of light and my normal, visual perceptions, it's like I was seeing things in a sort of, in its uric form. So the stronger some association, emotionally a place had or a thing had, the stronger it was, the more likely, I was to see it very vividly within the experience. So that building was one example, but there were many scenarios where I would see, like a significant place, like Avebury, for example, comes to mind, the ancient stone circle in Britain. That as well, I remember very vivid, energy around that location, and, very, very sort of like, almost like daylight, very sort of yellow, bright, light, around those kinds of, monoliths and things like that. So I think these things do seem to accumulate some kind of association, or possibly it's just some kind of collective awareness or part of a larger consciousness system, or some kind of way that our awareness understands these things. But that's how we experience them within the out-of-body experience, right through to a completely sort of normal way of perceiving as well, just like sort of normal vision. So it has a complete spectrum of ways that we can actually perceive things, from this completely celestial kind of perception right down to a sort of more ordinary perception. But I think that's because we probably we're pretty definitely not seeing with eyes when we're in an out-of-body experience. I think there's some kind of translation of information going on. I've just completed a chapter for a collaborative book that's going to be out later this year. And in that chapter, I discuss how there seems to be a relationship between the visual components, the colors, the way that you see in an out-of-body experience, and the visible light spectrum, the electromagnetic light spectrum. So it's almost like we see in two-tone, colors, at certain points within experiences, and in other experiences we see with the whole spectrum. So it's like the vision itself is a complex process, and it's something that I think even itself is very interesting to look into and to research, because how do we even see? I think we're seeing in an out-of-body experience almost directly with our consciousness. It's like we're bypassing the need for senses in a way.
Yeah, well, if you do a bit of reading about how our actual physical eyes work and how they translate information, shall we say, you sort of get some mind-blowing facts that really shake up your ideas about how we interact with reality with that particular sense. What about other people in these experiences? That is to say, are the experiences characterized by, or populated, should I say, by, strangers, people people that don't exist in the real world?
I generally will be in a location, so it will generally just be strangers. It will be like being out in the street and there'll be strangers around, or I'll be at a location far from where I am physically, sometimes even out of the planet. So it can be a very long way from where my physical body is. So sometimes the experiences are completely unpopulated, and sometimes just strangers, and on rare occasions I'll travel to someone that I know, but that happens less frequently. Although I think that's a very good process to use for many people, because you have an emotional draw, you're you're kind of more connected and more pulled psychically to someone that you're close to. And that's confirmed by research like what I did with Rupert Sheldrake. So the stronger your emotional connection and bond with someone, the better. And when it comes to psychical experiences. So, in general, I don't really, interact very much with people. I'm usually high up, so I'm not near to where people are, or if I'm near to people, they're usually people I don't know. And if I do interact, they're usually not aware of me, although on occasions people have described seeing me as a kind of shadow form, and that seems consistent across people's experiences because, for example, I had a student I was working with recently with my tuition, and he had an experience where he met his young son, his 9-year-old son, who also had his first ever out-of-body experience that night. And the father and son met in the kitchen, and they both saw each other as a shadow form. So this is seems to be quite a classic way that people perceive each other, or they'll see each other as they would look normally, usually even with clothes. So that's which I think is an interesting factor as well, because I think it suggests, at least to me, that there's some kind of mental projection of how you understand yourself to appear. Because in one instance, for example, one woman I worked with, her partner was actually skeptical, but he saw her in her normal physical form appearance wearing clothes, and then she disappeared. And then when he contacted her, it turned out he was correct in terms of what she was wearing that day, and she remembered the trip where she visited him as well. So those kinds of experiences are another form of evidence, I think, for the experience as well.
How do other people appear when you're in the state where your vision, your perception is altered?
It depends on the sort of filter. I call it the filter in terms of what I was describing with the different kinds of visual elements. So it depends. If I'm in that sort of auric state, then they'll appear as a sort of auric form. But people generally in that state are not as vivid as buildings and things like that, because I think a person doesn't have this sort of accumulated association or energy or etc. They have a kind of different quality, more of a living quality, which is different to the buildings and things. But then in another experience, they'll just appear like a normal person, as they do physically, or in another experience again, maybe all in one tone. Some of my most veridical, evidential out-of-body experiences had a blue-grey quality to them. I started to call them the cerulean state experiences, and in those experiences everything appears in a sort of bluish grey. So there's a sort of range of ways that people can appear, and I think it's more to do with the translation that's happening with my own visual perceptions, however that works, which is one of the areas I'm most interested in at the moment.
I read an account once by someone who had an out-of-body experience, and they found themselves hovering, many hundreds of miles above the Earth. And they said this was particularly mind-blowing just because that's a perspective that, unless we get in the space lab, we're just not likely to ever have. We can look at all the footage and all the pictures of the Earth we want, but I think that sort of experience that this person described would be absolutely incredible. And you mentioned going off-planet. So, that's beyond fascinating, really. Tell us about that.
Okay, it wasn't me who you read, was it? I had an experience in 2008.
Why, did that actually something that you said?
Yes.
Right, okay. This is something I read quite a long time ago.
Oh, okay.
And I'm recalling it from then, and it was in a book about remote viewing, actually.
Oh, okay. Then
so
it wasn't me then.
But no, as you were.
I had an experience, I think it was in 2008, in which I found myself in the upper atmosphere of the Earth, looking across the atmosphere. There was a kind of misty effect, as I was looking across. I wasn't sort of fully out of the planet. I was sort of on the edge of space, if you like. And I was looking to my right, and the Earth was creating a kind of, a diagonal right across my field of vision. So I was sort of seeing the Earth on this sort of edge. And I was just sort of hanging there in space, and I could sense the very, gentle rotation. I got the, sense of the continents, the movement of the clouds. And I was just watching the whole thing, and I was just completely awestruck by the vision of it. And I remember turning to my right a bit more. I never looked to the left. I turned to my right a little bit more out towards space. And I remember it just sort of, went black, which seemed more like actually like I almost, if you imagine you look into something that's very bright, or you, or there's a strong contrast between the foreground and the background, you get that blackening of your vision. So it's not literally that you're seeing black, it's actually that your vision becomes blacked out because of the contrast. It felt more like that than I was actually seeing the blackness of space. And I remember it almost felt like it was slightly uncomfortable to look at. So I looked back to the rotation of the Earth, and was just aware of being there for a few moments more, and then I think the experience ended. So that was one quite profound experience with space. And then another one I had, I think this one was 2012, I think. I found myself moving over what I initially thought was the moon. It had, the surface looked very much like the moon as we understand it and as we see it in images. But then as I was moving over the landscape, I started to think to myself, it doesn't look quite like the moon that I'm familiar with. I felt like it was in our solar system, just intuitively. I don't know why I felt that, but I did. But I started to realize that it wasn't our local moon. The quality of the surface was different. Then I came to a ridge that seemed to run the whole, center of the moon. And then there also seemed to be this, distinct discoloration on one side of the moon as well. So this is obviously quite characteristic. So I thought, well, hopefully I'll be able to, verify this, find a moon that does actually appear like that. So I traveled from one side of the moon to the other, and I think the experience ended pretty much as I got to the far side of the moon, which was actually quite a period of time. I mean, it wasn't like a few seconds or anything. That took quite a process to move from one side to the other. But then when the experience ended, I did a search on the internet, and I found Ipecatus. I'm not exactly sure how you pronounce it. But I think it's the third or fourth largest moon of Saturn. So it's, has all of those characteristics exactly as I saw them in the out of body experience. So again, it was something that, said to me that there was some validity and objectiveness to the experience that I had.
This raises the prospect that you can perhaps tell us how controllable these experiences are. Obviously, you've taught yourself to do it, but in terms of intention, because it's what you said, be like, well, if we could manage to make it so that we could travel to specific locations, like somewhere that far away, the potential for increasing knowledge would be huge.
Sure. I think the controllability is often overstated, as is the induction side of it. You often hear the phrase "at will," which you'll never hear me say. I'm very much against that idea because I think it's misleading to people. I think the whole doing things at will, it gives people the impression that it's about sort of willpower, which I think is completely false. I think it's almost the opposite. It's almost like, releasing yourself into the experience. It's not about pushing or forcing the experience. So, I think it's unhelpful in that sense. And it's also, I think, although the experience can happen I can induce it quite effectively, I wouldn't choose to do that unless the conditions were right for it to take place semi-naturally. Because if I did kind of push it to happen, the quality of the experience would be very low. The vision, the movement, everything would be quite poor quality. So basically, the types of experiences that I'm talking about, and I think that most people describe, are really the peak experiences. They're the experiences when everything is in motion and everything is in sync and things are completely working. The vision is excellent, etc. And those are the experiences that obviously we remember and we talk about. The more mundane experiences that don't move very well, the vision is quite poor, etc., etc. Those types of experiences tend not to get talked about, but I think it's important to emphasize that there's a range of different types of vision, different types of experiences, and different levels of controllability. And it seems the most profound experiences, at least in my case, I can't talk for everyone else, but at least in my case, the most profound experiences and the ones where I've been able to get witnesses to support what I've seen, etc. Those kinds of experiences have been more uncontrolled. They've been spontaneous, in the way that they've actually unfolded, not in terms of induction. I've induced them consciously, but then once the experience has been in motion, it's been much more spontaneous and I've allowed the experience to unfold. So I think in terms of using the experience to gain information and things like that, I think we need to understand more about what the experience is. And I think that's why the science is so important. But I think things like remote viewing are really excellent ways to try and hone those sorts of abilities and to gain more information and understanding about different things in a remote location. But what I think would be interesting is to bring in some of the controllability of remote viewing with some of the highly accurate, highly vivid vision that is possible in an out-of-body experience. I spoke at the International Remote Viewing Association conference in the US last year, and my talk at the conference was essentially about bringing together those two elements of the out-of-body experience and remote viewing, bringing them together to try and enhance both, if you like, to try and move towards a new way of looking at the two. And I guess over the years I've also worked with a lot of technology, immersive technology, virtual reality, hypnosis, different structures and things like that to try and enhance the experience. So I also think that the future is to incorporate technology and to try and enhance psi abilities in some ways too.
Yeah, you talked in the book, which is particularly interesting to me, with my musician's head on, about the importance of sound. We think of a lot of traditional and indigenous peoples using sound in ceremonies and as a way to, infuse their environment with a particular atmosphere, which, whether taken in conjunction with any other, mind-altering drugs or whatever it happened to be, but quite often not. It could be chanting and drumming, dancing, all these sorts of things. But the point was that there was a real key element in sound in altering their consciousness.
Sure, yeah. I think really what we're moving towards is in some ways refining or bringing in a more technological form of what a lot of shamanic cultures were doing. My virtual reality installation that I did at the Science Museum about a decade ago was one of the words we used was technosis. This idea of using technology as a way to sort of access these transcendent states. And I think really what the shaman were doing was using all of the senses and all of the different ways that we can affect our understanding or our consciousness and trying to do that in a way that that gives us access to these other levels or these other states of consciousness, etc. Psychoactive substances was one avenue, but they also used fasting, dancing, heat, cold, pain, solitude. There was a whole range of different things that shaman have historically used and still historically use. It tends to get focused on the sort of psychoactive side of things, which is obviously one avenue. It's not one I've personally gone down because I just wanted to keep things more, I guess I think mixing the things that were happening to me naturally with psychoactive substances seemed like a bad mix to some degree. And I've seen several people suffer from psychosis as a result of mixing the two. So, for me, it was, I decided that wasn't the route I wanted to go, but I still wanted to explore other avenues that would alter consciousness in some way. So sound, sensory deprivation, things like that have always been something I've been very interested in. And I started to initially work with things like binaural beats because, Robert Monroe, for example, has used those to quite good effect, in the past. So I was kind of interested on that level, but then I found that they didn't seem to have much effect with me, and they didn't seem to give me the sort of impact that I wanted. So I started to experiment with using frequencies in other forms, and I started to work with infrasound and also incorporate different structures of sound patterns to see how the sound patterns would work, which gets back to the shamanic side of things because they use, it's more rhythms. It's almost like lights as well. Some different groups I've been involved with have used strobe lights to create a different state, like the Lucia device, which is popular at the moment, uses a strobe light to create these optical effects that can possibly alter consciousness. So you've got light and sound used in a sort of rhythmic form can create changes in perception. So I focused on using sound to try and induce the vibrational state, and that eventually led to my infraliminal sound technology, which is focused on inducing the vibrational state, which is a key state in the early stages of the out-of-body experience. And that seems to work with the majority of people. So that's kind of the journey I've been on with all of those things. So I think I've explored most things from sensory deprivation through to using sort of trance movement, which I describe in my first book a bit more, right through to complex technologies like virtual reality.
Consider the use of combinations of light and sound in places like churches, other religious buildings, and you've got, of course, a rock concert. It's all about light and sound, and people can certainly get into borderline ecstatic states in places like that. Sure,
yeah. I think I might have even mentioned in the first book, I think it was, where I sort of almost say that the temple, the idea of a temple, was always to create this spiritual state through all of the senses. If you think about it, you walk into a temple, you have the visual side, the architecture, the structure, the form, the artwork, the paintings, etc., the stained glass, depending on what type of temple it is. Incense is used in nearly all cultures as well to create a smell. Then you have, the music and the sound and the singing. And so there's those kinds of multisensory experiences have been used across cultures. Even in Finland and Estonia, where I've spent a lot of time, there's a tradition of using the sauna as a way to purify yourself. For example, New Year's Eve, they would go into a sauna, and be in that intense heat environment, to purify themselves and to prepare themselves for the coming year. That would also be done at weddings and different things like that. So it was that kind of immersive experience was about transforming yourself, purifying yourself, taking yourself to another level. Different kinds of tribal cultures have used things like pain as well. Pain was generally seen as a purifying thing for centuries, even in Europe. That idea of pain actually brought you closer to God. In Christianity, nuns and people like that to this day still cause themselves pain to bring themselves closer to the suffering of Christ and things like that. And then you go through to sort of modern primitives like Fakir Mustafa, who hangs himself from hooks and has had out-of-body experiences through doing that, through putting hooks through his chest, which is based on the Native American ceremony. So all of these different kinds of things can lead to these ecstatic states and these out-of-body experiences and things like that. They're part of a bigger cultural map, I think, and the out-of-body experience, obviously, within shamanic cultures has always been used as a way to travel to the other world, to bring back healing and things like that. So it's fundamental to our most ancient forms of spirituality, really.
I did read somewhere an article about the medieval cathedrals and how different they were to, almost anything else that existed at the time, apart from maybe, palaces and what have you. But the peasant folk coming in from the country would go into one of these cathedrals and it would be so removed from any reality they had ever experienced that they would be awestruck. And if you look at these things today, I live in a cathedral city right here and there's still very, very impressive buildings. It's hard to imagine what that looked like to someone living, 400 years ago.
Sure, yeah. It must have been awesome in terms of the power structures. So I guess that's the not so positive side of it. It would have been a kind of power politics thing as well. But to take it onto a more personal, spiritual level, of course, to have free access to something like that you could walk into, that just, to this day, I mean, I'm definitely not Christian and not really drawn to those kinds of things. And like most British families, or many British families, my parents are kind of lapsed Church of England. They never went to church in my childhood and never really talked about it. But if you ask them, would probably by default say that they were some form of Christian. At least my mother would, I think. But I think that, those kinds of things would have had a huge effect on people. And I think even today, those places can transform your state of consciousness. I always feel different when I go into a temple. I've been into some very ancient ones in India, for example. I went to a tantric style temple that was, I think, about 4,000 years old, something like that, carved with sexual images on the outside. And I went into it, and the inside is very, very dark and was full of bats. The whole of the upper part of the temple was full of bats. So there was the intense smell of the bats as you walked in, and then the Shiva Lingam in the middle, the kind of sexual spiritual symbol that stands in Hindu temples. And the literally centuries of paint from where the people had been doing their blessing on it. And although the environment was quite uncomfortable to be in, I also just felt this intense spiritual energy from being in there, this kind of completely amazing feeling. It did almost feel like the space was lit up, but there was no light coming in. It was very, very dark, because you walk through a very small entrance and then it opens up into a kind of chamber in the middle. So things like that, I think, the ancientness of them and the distinctiveness of them really have a powerful effect.
Well, Graham, as we begin to wind things up for today, I just want to throw out a big thought there. I mean, I think what we've discussed, and certainly reading your books, there's a lot that I think that out-of-body experiences can potentially tell us about the fundamental nature of reality, perhaps how everything is ultimately unified, and perhaps all just one big energetic field, as I sort of speculated earlier. But have you discerned anything I mean, obviously we're talking about stuff here that's speculative and based on subjective personal experiences, but have you had any sort of ponderings about the possibility of life existing beyond the body? You know, life after death, reincarnation, that whole area, which can potentially open up if we're just having an open-minded discussion about these areas. You know, we can go there, if you know what I mean.
Oh, sure. I think there's just as much to support some idea of a continuation of consciousness as any of the other evidence. I think actually it's interesting that, especially reincarnation evidence, you mentioned reincarnation. I think that's one of the areas that actually challenges people who don't think there's anything in these things more than anything. I know that even Carl Sagan, who created the extraordinary claims quote, or at least reworded it, he was open to further research in the area of reincarnation memories in children. And I recently heard Chris French in an interview on a Guardian blog post or radio post, where he describes that a reincarnation case, actually one that I mentioned in my second book, of a boy who had memories of living on an island called Burra off of the north of Scotland. There was actually a documentary made on it. He said that was one of the cases that challenged him and made him sit up and think possibly there is something there. So I think reincarnation for sure, just in terms of the evidence, is quite strong. But even in terms of my own personal experiences, I've had things that are very, very hard to ignore in terms of traveling to levels that appeared to be the afterlife. One experience where I witnessed a large group of people who seemed to be in distress at a distance in a sort of misty environment, very much like the stereotypical afterlife in many ways. But when I came out of the experience, I found that there'd actually been a plane crash within a few hours, basically, of the experience that I had. So that was very interesting and made me think, well, maybe what I saw was actually people from that crash. I can't be 100% sure, but I think that experiences like that, when you put it together with all the other things I've talked about, I think it really makes it very difficult to dismiss the idea that there's more to consciousness and that it could continue in some way.
Finally, do you believe, maybe that's not the right word, but that these experiences have any purpose?
Purpose is a big word. I tend to look more that we create meaning and purpose, and we kind of we build those things into our lives and into the experiences. I don't really subscribe to the idea of a sort of hierarchical spirituality where there's a sort of preordained outlook to things. I haven't seen much to convince me of that. I tend to look at it more as a grassroots sort of growing outward, expanding towards other levels, and I think that maybe those other levels are just a natural part of the reality that we live in. But exactly what they are, where they exist, and what their purpose is, I don't know. Of course, if I came across reasons to sort of conclude there was a purpose, I would definitely take that on. But I guess in the years that I've sort of wondered about that, wondered why I saw that first apparition as a child, or why I had a premonition of the Soho bombing in London, or why I've had all these unusual experiences, or even quite unusual things like having experiences of the sort of entire life cycle of a small animal and things like this. I don't know what the purpose to those things are, but what I can say is that all of that stuff has impacted me to the point that I've become a very sort of egalitarian type person and very focused on being more positive. I've become vegan, so I try to minimize harm to other living things. I focus on compassion and openness. And so I have arrived at this very much a spiritual destination in a way, or I'm on a spiritual process, in my life, regardless of whether I actually categorize it as such or whether I, ascribe to one particular, worldview or religion or spiritual viewpoint or whatever. So, I think I'm a sort of, agnostically spiritual, I guess, is how I would look at it.
Okay, Graham. Well, as we mentioned at the top of the show, you've got books available. Those are available everywhere, really. But tell folks about your website, the resources there, because, of course, you run courses. The good news is that people can learn to have these experiences for themselves. So just tell folks about that and anything else you'd like to put out there.
Sure. Well, my website has got quite a lot of content on it. I'm always adding articles and things like that. I just posted an article on the differences between lucid dreams and out-of-body experiences just today. There's lots of stuff like that on there. There's a course I've just recently launched, which is an online 5-week course called the Navigator course, which goes into everything you need to know to have out-of-body experiences, and can be done from anywhere in the world. And all the lectures, etc., are live, but they're recorded as well, so can be watched back afterwards. And then I also do one-on-one training through that site. And if people are interested in my sound technology, there's a big article explaining the history and the results of that sound technology. And also, you can get a copy of it from the site as well. It's available as a USB device and also as a download. So there's loads of resources and info on there, and that's grahamnicholls.com with 2 L's in Nicholls.
Excellent. Well, Graham, thank you so much for spending time with us today on legalizefreedom.com.
You're welcome.
Well, folks, that's it for another week. As ever, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, check out the website, which is legalizefreedom.com. That's legalize-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programs offering alternative views on a wide range of topics, including politics and economics, energy and environment, culture, spirituality, history, and the nature of reality. You can also browse and buy a range of publications from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Based on current audience numbers, if everyone who tuned in donated just 5 pence per show, that's about 8 cents US, this could become a full-time, fully funded operation, offering more and more often. During October 2014, over 50,000 of you streamed or downloaded at least one show. Total donations were £7 UK, which currently converts to about $11 US. Whether you listen, donate, or do both, I greatly appreciate your support. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalizefreedom.com.